Most epic revenge stories in medieval history. Revenge in medieval history was never quiet. It was never subtle. And it was almost never forgotten. In a world where honor meant survival and humiliation could destroy an entire bloodline, revenge wasn't just personal, it was political. It was religious. It was generational. And sometimes it reshaped entire kingdoms. One of the most famous and brutal revenge stories begins in 1066 with a man who refused to accept humiliation. His name was William the Conqueror. But before he conquered England, he was known as William the Bastard. That name wasn't just an insult. It was a weapon. William was the illegitimate son of Robert I of Normandy. In medieval Europe, illegitimacy was more than a stain on your reputation. It was an open invitation for rebellion. And rebellion came quickly. When William became Duke of Normandy as a child, the nobles around him didn't see a ruler. They saw an opportunity. Assassinations erupted. Castles revolted. Allies betrayed him. As a boy, William reportedly slept in different locations every night to avoid being murdered. Imagine growing up knowing your guardians might kill you. That kind of childhood does something to a person. It hardens them. By the time William became an adult, he had crushed multiple rebellions in Normandy. He had learned one lesson very well. Mercy invites weakness. Then came the ultimate insult. The English throne. In 1066, King Edward the Confessor died without an heir. William claimed Edward had promised him the English crown. But the powerful English noble, Harold Godwinson, crowned himself king instead. To William, this wasn't just politics. It was betrayal. According to Norman sources, Harold had even sworn an oath to support William's claim. Breaking an oath in medieval Europe wasn't just dishonorable. It was spiritually dangerous. Oaths were made before God. William didn't simply want England. He wanted revenge. The result was the Battle of Hastings. When William landed in England, he didn't rush blindly. He forced Harold to march south after fighting another invasion in the north. Harold's army was exhausted. William's forces were prepared. The battle lasted all day, and by nightfall, Harold was dead. Legend says an arrow struck him in the eye. Whether that's true or not, what followed was undeniable. William didn't stop at victory. He punished resistance with fire. Entire regions in northern England were destroyed in what became known as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. Famine followed. It wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated revenge. If England had dared deny him, England would suffer until it submitted. Thousands died. Some historians estimate over 100,000 people perished from starvation and devastation in the aftermath. William had taken his crown. But more importantly, he had erased humiliation. And that was only the beginning of medieval revenge. Another story unfolds in Scotland, and it carries a different kind of fury. This one is about betrayal so deep it ignited a national legend. The name most people know is William Wallace. Wallace wasn't born into great power. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even particularly wealthy. But he had something more dangerous: anger. In the late 13th century, Scotland was under pressure from England's ambitious king, Edward I of England. Edward didn't just want influence. He wanted control. Scottish nobles were forced to swear loyalty. English officials imposed authority, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. The turning point for Wallace wasn't a grand political speech. It was personal. According to later legends, an English sheriff executed Wallace's wife, Marion Braidfoot. Historical accuracy is debated, but the emotional truth of the story shaped centuries of memory. Wallace retaliated. He killed the sheriff, and that act of revenge wasn't strategic. It was explosive. It triggered a rebellion. Soon, Wallace became a symbol. Farmers joined him. Minor nobles joined him. Ordinary men who had lost land, pride, or family rallied to his cause. Then came the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The English army was larger, better equipped, confident. But Wallace and his ally Andrew Moray used the narrow bridge to their advantage. As English troops crossed, the Scots attacked. The bridge became a death trap. The English were crushed. It was a humiliating defeat for Edward I. Wallace's revenge had turned into national defiance. But medieval revenge rarely ends cleanly. Edward I responded with overwhelming force. At the Battle of Falkirk, the English used longbows to devastating effect. Scottish forces were broken. Wallace fled. Betrayal followed. He was captured in 1305. What happened next was meant to crush hope. Wallace was tried for treason in London. He argued he could not be a traitor because he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. It didn't matter. He was executed brutally. A public display designed to intimidate Scotland forever. But here's the twist of medieval revenge. It didn't work. Wallace's death fueled the rise of another leader, Robert the Bruce. Bruce initially submitted to Edward. He even killed a rival, John Comyn, in a church. An act that shocked Europe. But eventually, Bruce turned fully against English rule. At the Battle of Bannockburn, Bruce defeated a much larger English army. It was a defining moment. England had tried to dominate Scotland through humiliation and execution. Instead, they had created martyrs, and Scotland gained its independence, at least for a time. That is the paradox of medieval revenge. Sometimes it destroys. Sometimes it builds nations. Now let's travel south into France, where one king's revenge would destroy an entire order of warriors. The target? The Knights Templar. And the man behind it was Philip IV of France. Philip was deeply in debt. Wars were expensive. Royal ambitions cost money, and the Templars were rich. The Knights Templar had grown powerful during the Crusades. They controlled land, money, and even operated an early banking system. Philip needed funds. He also needed control. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip made his move. Templars across France were arrested simultaneously. They were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and shocking crimes. Under torture, many confessed. Whether the accusations were true remains heavily debated. Most historians believe they were fabricated. But Philip wasn't looking for truth. He wanted revenge against creditors. He wanted their wealth. He wanted their power erased. Eventually, the Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. Legend says that before dying, de Molay cursed Philip IV and Pope Clement V, summoning them before God within a year. Both men died within months. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in medieval Europe, such timing felt like divine justice. Philip had destroyed the Templars. But he had also cemented his reputation as ruthless. And once again, revenge reshaped history. These are only the opening chapters. Medieval revenge didn't stop with kings and knights. It appeared in castles, monasteries, battlefields, and even family feuds that lasted generations. Blood answered blood. Honor answered insult. And sometimes revenge became legend. Medieval revenge was rarely quick. It often waited. It watched. And when it finally struck, it did so with a force that echoed across generations. One of the most calculated acts of revenge in medieval history began not on a battlefield, but in a banquet hall. It involves a king, a betrayal, and a dinner invitation that turned into a bloodbath. The king was Robert the Bruce. But his story is not about his victory at Bannockburn. It is about the Black Dinner. In the 15th century, Scotland was fragile. The monarchy was young. Power was divided between noble families who constantly competed for influence over the crown. Two of the most powerful were the Douglases, and their rivals aligned with the crown. The young Earl of Douglas and his brother were invited to dine at Edinburgh Castle under royal protection. They were just boys, teenagers. The dinner began normally. Conversation, food, courtesy. Then, near the end of the meal, a black bull's head was placed on the table. In medieval Scotland, this was not decoration. It was a death symbol. The boys were dragged outside and executed. The event became known as the Black Dinner, and it ignited a feud that would tear Scotland apart for decades. The Douglas family never forgot. Revenge became their mission. Over the next years, they rose again in power. They gathered allies. They positioned themselves close to the throne. Eventually, another dramatic confrontation occurred in 1452. King James II of Scotland invited William, 8th Earl of Douglas, to Stirling Castle under safe conduct. History repeated itself, but this time differently. James demanded Douglas break an alliance with rebellious nobles. Douglas refused. An argument followed, and then the king himself stabbed Douglas. Courtiers finished the job. It was shocking. A king murdering a guest under protection. But in the brutal logic of medieval politics, it was survival. The Douglases retaliated again, burning towns and rallying forces. Yet over time, the crown crushed their power. This was revenge spiraling back and forth. A cycle of humiliation and retaliation that nearly shattered Scotland. Now we move east, to the Byzantine Empire, where revenge could be even colder. In 11th century Constantinople, betrayal didn't always mean death. Sometimes it meant something worse, blinding. In Byzantine politics, blinding was a favored method of revenge and control. A blinded man could not rule. Physical perfection was seen as necessary for emperorship. One of the most infamous revenge stories centers on Basil II. He would later be called the Bulgar Slayer. But that title was earned through vengeance. For decades, Basil fought against the Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel. The conflict drained resources and pride from Byzantium. At the Battle of Clivion, Basil finally trapped the Bulgarian army. The defeat was catastrophic. What happened next became legend. According to chroniclers, Basil ordered thousands of Bulgarian prisoners blinded. Every group of 100 men was left with one man half blind to guide the others home. When Tsar Samuel saw his returning army, thousands of blinded soldiers, he reportedly suffered a stroke and died shortly after. It was revenge not just against an army, but against a rival empire's morale. The psychological impact broke Bulgarian resistance for years. Brutal. Calculated. Effective. In medieval warfare, terror was a weapon. But not all revenge came from kings. Sometimes it came from queens. Few stories are as haunting as that of Isabella of France. She married Edward II of England as a teenager. Their marriage was politically useful and personally miserable. Edward favored his male companions openly, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Isabella was sidelined, ignored, humiliated. But she was not powerless. When tensions in England grew due to Edward's unpopular rule and favoritism, Isabella saw opportunity. She traveled to France under diplomatic pretext, and she did not return quietly. There she formed an alliance and a relationship with the exiled English noble Roger Mortimer. Together, they raised an invasion force. In 1326, Isabella landed in England. Support flooded to her side. Nobles defected. Cities opened their gates. Edward fled. he was captured. Spencer was executed brutally. Mortimer ensured that message was clear. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. Soon after, he died in captivity under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was natural causes. Unofficially, many believed it was murder. Isabella had overthrown her husband, a medieval queen who refused humiliation, and replaced the king. But revenge often turns inward. Years later, her own son, Edward III of England, seized power from Mortimer. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was spared but removed from authority. Even successful revenge can consume its architects. Now let's travel to Scandinavia, where revenge sometimes took the shape of blood eagles and burning halls. One of the most legendary, though partly mythologized, revenge tales involves Ivar the Boneless. Ivar was one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. According to Norse sagas, Ragnar was executed by the Northumbrian king Aella of Northumbria, thrown into a pit of snakes. Before dying, Ragnar reportedly declared that his sons would avenge him, and they did. The great heathen army invaded England in 865. City after city fell. Eventually, Aella was captured. The sagas claim he was executed by the Blood Eagle, a ritual so gruesome that historians debate whether it truly occurred or was later exaggeration. What matters is the symbolism. A father humiliated, sons responding with devastating conquest. Revenge that changed the balance of power in England for decades. By now, a pattern should be clear. Medieval revenge was rarely isolated. It triggered wars. It ended dynasties. It rewrote borders. And sometimes it reshaped entire cultures. But we're only getting started. Revenge in the medieval world did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it waited years. And sometimes it wore a crown. One of the most devastating revenge stories in the late medieval Europe unfolded not through open warfare at first, but through calculated assassination. The kind that changes the course of a century. To understand it, we must step into the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. The rivalry between England and France had already simmered for decades. Claims to the French throne, shifting alliances, humiliations on the battlefield. All of it built tension that refused to disappear. But in the early 15th century, France was collapsing from within. King Charles VI of France suffered from severe bouts of mental illness. During his episodes, he failed to recognize his own family. He believed himself made of glass. He could not effectively rule. This weakness created a power vacuum. Two major factions competed for control of France: the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. At the center of this storm stood John the Fearless. His name was not poetic exaggeration. He had already proven himself ruthless. In 1407, John orchestrated the assassination of Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, in the streets of Paris. It was a calculated strike. Louis was gaining influence over the unstable king. John eliminated him and publicly justified the murder as a necessary act against tyranny. The result? Civil war inside France. Armagnac supporters, loyal to the murdered duke's family, swore vengeance. Blood answered blood. Cities changed hands. Massacres erupted. France weakened itself while England watched carefully. Years passed. Then came 1419. France was desperate. The young Dauphin, the future Charles VII of France, sought reconciliation with Burgundy to unite against the English threat. A meeting was arranged on a bridge at Montereau. It was supposed to be peace. Instead, it became revenge. During the meeting, Dauphin loyalists attacked and killed John the Fearless, struck down during negotiations. Whether the Dauphin personally ordered it remains debated. But politically, responsibility fell on him. And that assassination changed everything. John's son, Philip the Good, did not forgive. He allied Burgundy with England. This alliance allowed Henry V of England to press his claim to the French throne far more effectively. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 disinherited the Dauphin and recognized Henry V as heir to France. One act of revenge had nearly handed France to England. That is the medieval pattern. Revenge rarely ends the conflict. It multiplies it. But while France tore itself apart, another kind of revenge was forming. One led by a teenage girl. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was not royalty, she was not noble, but she carried something powerful, belief. When English forces and their Burgundian allies tightened their grip on France, the Dauphin's cause seemed doomed. Joan claimed divine visions. She said God had chosen her to drive out the English and crown Charles as king. Whether one believes her visions or not, her impact was undeniable. In 1429, she helped lift the siege of Orleans, a turning point in the war. It was not just a military victory. It was psychological revenge. France had been humiliated for years, crushed at Agincourt, divided by civil war, betrayed by its own nobility. Joan reversed that narrative. She escorted Charles to Reims for his coronation. He became Charles VII. But revenge stories rarely grant simple triumph. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English. Her trial was political theater. She was accused of heresy. The English needed to destroy her legitimacy, and by extension, the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation. In 1431, she was burned at the stake, 19 years old. But death did not silence her impact. 25 years later, a retrial declared her innocent. Centuries later, she became a symbol of French resistance and unity. In the long arc of history, Joan's execution backfired. Her death became fuel, and France eventually expelled the English from nearly all its territory. The revenge was slow, but it came. Now let's shift to a story darker, more intimate, and deeply personal. This one unfolds in Italy, a land of city-states, intrigue, poison, and family vendettas. In 1478, Florence was under the powerful influence of the Medici family. At the center was Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. But not everyone admired Medici dominance. The rival Pazzi family, backed by powerful allies, including elements within the church, plotted revenge against Medici control. The plan was bold. Kill Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass in the Florence Cathedral on Easter Sunday. During the most sacred moment of the service, assassins struck. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed repeatedly and killed. Lorenzo was wounded but escaped into the sacristy. The attack failed in its most important objective. Lorenzo survived. And then came his revenge. The response was swift and merciless. Pazzi conspirators were hunted down. Some were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Others were tortured or exiled. Even the Archbishop of Pisa, involved in the plot, was executed. Florence watched bodies swing above the streets. This was not quiet justice. It was a public warning. Challenge the Medici, and you die. But Lorenzo did not stop there. He maneuvered politically against the Pope, survived a war sparked by the conspiracy, and ultimately strengthened his grip on Florence. The Pazzi name became synonymous with failure, and Lorenzo's power became legend. Revenge had secured a dynasty. Revenge in medieval history could be personal, political, spiritual, or dynastic. Sometimes it was a dagger in the dark. Sometimes it was a war that lasted a century. Sometimes it was a queen toppling the king. Sometimes it was a girl with a banner rewriting national destiny. But the most terrifying revenge stories are still ahead. If medieval Europe mastered the art of revenge, the Mongols perfected it. Their revenge did not target one man. It erased civilizations. And it began with an insult. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan had already united the Mongol tribes and forged them into a terrifying military force. But contrary to popular myth, he did not begin by trying to conquer the entire known world. He began with trade. He sent merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II. The Mongols sought commercial relations, not war. But something went wrong. The governor of Otrar accused the Mongol trade caravan of espionage. The merchants were executed, their goods were seized. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, the Shah responded with arrogance. He executed one of the Mongol envoys and humiliated the others. In steppe culture, envoys were sacred. Killing them was not just a political act. It was a declaration of total hostility. Genghis Khan's response was not immediate rage, it was preparation. In 1219, the Mongol army advanced west. What followed was not a campaign, it was annihilation. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand fell. Some resisted, some surrendered. It did not matter. Mass slaughter followed many sieges. Skilled artisans were spared, others were killed. Entire urban populations disappeared. The Shah fled across his empire, city after city collapsing behind him. He died in exile, hunted by the consequences of his own decision. The Khwarezmian Empire was shattered beyond recovery, all because a ruler chose humiliation over diplomacy. Mongol revenge was not emotional. It was systematic. It was meant to send a message to the entire world. Do not insult us. But revenge in medieval history was not always executed by conquerors. Sometimes it came from rulers who refused to be broken. One of the most dramatic examples comes from Eastern Europe. Her name was Olga of Kiev. Her husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, was murdered by the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe, after attempting to collect tribute. The Drevlians believed they had solved a problem. Instead, they created one. After Igor's death, the Drevlians sent messengers to Olga proposing that she marry their prince, effectively uniting their lands. They assumed she would accept. She did not. Instead, she invited the envoys to her court. She had them thrown into a pit and buried alive. Then she sent word to the Drevlians asking for more distinguished envoys. When they arrived, she invited them to bathe before meeting her. She had the bathhouse locked and burned it down. Still, she was not finished. She traveled to the Drevlian capital under the pretense of holding a funeral feast for her husband. When the Drevlians became drunk, her soldiers slaughtered thousands. And finally, when the city still resisted, she devised a final act. She asked for tribute. Not gold, not silver, but birds from every household. When the birds were delivered, her forces tied burning materials to their legs and released them. The birds returned to their nests. The city ignited from within. Whether every detail of the story is perfectly accurate is debated by historians. Medieval chronicles often mixed fact with dramatic embellishment. But the core truth remains. Olga destroyed the people who murdered her husband, completely. And later, she converted to Christianity and became a saint. Revenge and sanctity, side by side. That is medieval contradiction. Now we turn to a revenge that changed the Mediterranean forever. In 1282, the island of Sicily was under the control of Charles of Anjou, a French ruler whose regime was deeply unpopular among the locals. Heavy taxation, foreign officials, arrogance, resentment simmered for years. Then, during Easter Monday in Palermo, a French soldier reportedly insulted a Sicilian woman. It sparked a riot. The uprising became known as the Sicilian Vespers. What followed was not a simple riot. It was a massacre. Sicilians began hunting down French residents across the island. Thousands were killed. French men, women, and even children were targeted. It was revenge for years of humiliation and foreign dominance. But like so many medieval revenge stories, it did not end locally. The uprising drew in the crown of Aragon, which invaded Sicily in support of the rebels. This triggered a wider conflict across Europe involving the papacy, France, and Spain. One moment of vengeance ignited a geopolitical struggle. Again, the pattern repeats. Revenge spreads. And then there is perhaps one of the most relentless personal revenge stories in medieval Iberia. It involves Pedro I of Castile, known by two very different nicknames: Pedro the Cruel, Pedro the Just, depending on which side you were on. Pedro's reign was filled with betrayals and noble rebellions. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, led repeated uprisings against him. Henry eventually captured and killed Pedro in 1369, personally stabbing him during a confrontation. But before his death, Pedro had unleashed a reign of vengeance against those who betrayed him. Nobles were executed. Rivals were hunted down. Even members of his own extended family were not safe. His methods were ruthless. Yet supporters argued he was simply punishing treason. This dual identity, tyrant or avenger, is common in medieval rulers. Revenge often depends on perspective. If you win, you are just. If you lose, you are cruel. By now, one truth is unavoidable. Medieval revenge was rarely about closure. It was about power. It was about sending messages. It was about reshaping fear. The Mongols avenged insult with extinction. Olga avenged murder with annihilation. Sicily avenged oppression with massacre. Kings avenged betrayal with execution. And none of it ended the cycle, because every act of revenge created the next one. By the late Middle Ages, revenge had become almost institutional. It wasn't just emotional retaliation anymore. It was policy. It was propaganda. It was a warning carved into the memory of entire populations. One of the most explosive revenge moments in English medieval history came not from a king trying to conquer foreign lands, but from common people rising against their own ruler. The year was 1381. England was exhausted. The long strain of the 100 Years' War, devastating outbreaks of plague, and repeated taxation had pushed the population to its limits. The government imposed a harsh poll tax, and resentment boiled over. What began as protest became rebellion. This uprising became known as the Peasants' Revolt. At its center stood a charismatic leader, Wat Tyler. The rebels marched toward London. They weren't a small riot. They were organized, angry, and determined. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and the removal of corrupt royal officials. Shockingly, they reached the capital. London's gates opened. Government buildings were attacked, records burned. Prominent officials were hunted down and killed. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, a powerful political figure, was executed by the rebels. For a moment, it seemed like medieval England might truly transform. The young king, Richard II of England, only 14 years old, agreed to meet the rebels. It was a tense confrontation. Wat Tyler spoke boldly. Accounts differ, but during the meeting, a dispute broke out. The Lord Mayor of London struck Tyler. Royal attendants finished the job. Wat Tyler lay dead. The crowd could have exploded into chaos. Instead, Richard II rode forward and declared himself their leader, promising reforms. The rebels dispersed, and then the revenge began. Royal forces tracked down rebel leaders. Promises were revoked. Executions followed. Heads were displayed publicly. The message was unmistakable. Challenge the crown, and you will be erased. The peasants' revolt terrified England's ruling class. It showed how fragile authority truly was. Richard II had survived. But years later, he would face his own reckoning. Revenge is rarely satisfied with one victim. Now we move to Spain, a land where religious conflict and political ambition blended into centuries of bloodshed. The Reconquista, the long campaign by Christian kingdoms to reclaim Iberian territory from Muslim rule, had lasted hundreds of years. It was not a single war, but a grinding process of advance and retreat. By the late 15th century, only one major Muslim kingdom remained in Iberia, Granada. The rulers who would end it were Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Their marriage united powerful Christian territories. Their goal was clear. Granada would fall. The war lasted a decade. Siege after siege tightened around the final Muslim stronghold. In 1492, Granada surrendered. But conquest was only the beginning. In the years that followed, forced conversions, expulsions, and persecution intensified. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition created an atmosphere of fear and religious scrutiny. From the perspective of the Catholic monarchs, this was divine justice. Centuries of occupation answered with purification. From another perspective, it was revenge on a massive scale. Families who had lived in Iberia for generations were forced to convert or leave. The medieval world often blurred the line between faith and vengeance. Religion could sanctify retaliation. But perhaps one of the most personal revenge stories in medieval England involves a queen whose anger reshaped royal power. Her name was Margaret of Anjou. She married King Henry VI of England during a fragile period in the 100 Years' War. Henry was gentle, devout, and politically weak. When he suffered a mental breakdown, power struggles intensified between rival factions of English nobility. This tension erupted into the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. Margaret refused to be passive. When Richard, Duke of York, challenged Henry's rule, Margaret saw it not merely as rebellion, but as a threat to her son's inheritance. At the Battle of Wakefield, York was defeated and killed. According to some accounts, his head was displayed with a paper crown placed mockingly upon it. It was humiliation layered onto death. Margaret had avenged the insult to her husband's crown. But again, revenge did not end the war. It intensified it. Years of shifting victories followed. Betrayals, executions, reversals of fortune. Eventually, the Yorkist claimant, Edward IV of England, secured the throne. Margaret's son was killed. Her husband died in captivity. She was imprisoned. In the end, her vengeance bought temporary victory, but not lasting security. Medieval revenge often won battles and lost wars. And then there is one of the most dramatic acts of judicial revenge in French history. In 1386, a knight named Jean de Carouge accused another nobleman, Jacques Legris, of assaulting his wife. The case went to trial. Evidence was unclear. Testimonies conflicted. The French court, under Charles VI of France, allowed something extraordinary: a trial by combat. The belief was simple. God would grant victory to the truthful party. If Carouge lost, his wife would be executed for false accusation. It was revenge balanced on the edge of faith. The duel was brutal. In the end, Carouge killed Legris. The crowd erupted. From Carouge's perspective, justice had been served, honor restored. From a broader view, it was medieval society's attempt to let divine judgment settle human vengeance. It was one of the last officially sanctioned judicial duels in France. Even in a world soaked in revenge, there were moments when societies tried to contain it. By now, revenge has taken many forms in our journey. Mass slaughter by empire, personal vendetta by widows, religious retaliation, royal suppression, dynastic warfare, judicial combat. And still, we are not done. By the time the medieval world began to approach its end, revenge had become something almost ritualized. It was no longer only personal anger. It was destiny. It was memory. It was history refusing to forget. And few events embody that better than the fall of a city that had stood for over 1,000 years. The year was 1453. The city was Constantinople. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been a shadow of its former glory. Once the heart of Eastern Christendom, once the jewel of Roman civilization, it had shrunk to little more than its capital and fragments of territory. Surrounded, isolated, waiting. The Ottoman Sultan who would change everything was Mehmed II. He was young, only 21 when he began the final siege. But he was not reckless. He was driven. For generations, Ottoman rulers had tried and failed to capture Constantinople. The city had resisted through diplomacy, alliances, and its massive walls. To Mehmed, conquering it was not just strategy. It was fulfillment. It was vengeance for past humiliations inflicted on his predecessors. The siege lasted weeks. Massive cannons battered walls that had stood for a millennium. Ships were dragged over land to bypass harbor chains. Assault after assault hammered the defenses. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos refused to flee. He chose to die with his city. On May 29, 1453, the walls were breached. Constantine XI vanished in the fighting. His body never definitively identified. Constantinople fell. What followed was devastation. Soldiers looted. Churches were seized. The great Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. From the Ottoman perspective, this was the completion of a centuries-long struggle. From the Byzantine perspective, it was apocalypse. But history rarely frames itself in only one way. For Mehmed II, this was not chaos. It was calculated dominance. He declared himself the new Roman emperor. The city would not be erased. It would be reborn under his rule. Revenge had not only destroyed an empire, it had created another. But revenge does not always wear the face of a conqueror. Sometimes it comes from betrayal so personal, it reshapes entire wars. During the Crusades, alliances were fragile, ambitions vast, and trust almost non-existent. One of the most dramatic revenge arcs belongs to Raynald of Chatillon. Raynald was bold, reckless, and deeply provocative. He attacked Muslim caravans during times of truce. He raided trade routes near Mecca. He pushed boundaries repeatedly. His actions were not simply military. They were deliberate insults. To the Muslim world, and particularly to one man, that man was Saladin. Saladin had united much of the Muslim Near East under his leadership. He sought to reclaim Jerusalem from Crusader control. Raynald gave him the justification. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin crushed the Crusader forces. The defeat was catastrophic. Jerusalem soon fell. But what happened to Raynald was personal. Captured after the battle, he was brought before Saladin. Accounts describe Saladin offering water to the Crusader king, but not to Raynald. He reminded Raynald of his broken truces and provocations. Then Saladin executed him himself. It was not battlefield chaos. It was deliberate. A ruler avenging dishonor. Yet even here, complexity emerges. Saladin became known in both Muslim and even some European chronicles as a ruler of restraint and dignity. Revenge did not erase reputation. Sometimes it strengthened it. In Italy, revenge could simmer for generations. The cities of Florence, Siena, Venice, Milan, they were not united under one crown. They were rivals, and nowhere was revenge more refined than within noble blood feuds. The conflict between the Guelphs and Ghibellines tore through Italian politics for centuries. These factions represented allegiance to the papacy or the Holy Roman Emperor. But over time, ideology blurred into family vendetta. In Florence, the feud between the white and black Guelphs led to exile, confiscation, and executions. One of the most famous exiles was Dante Alighieri. Dante was expelled from Florence after political rivals seized power. He would never return. His revenge was not physical. It was literary. In his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, Dante placed many of his political enemies in hell, condemned eternally in verse. In medieval society, reputation was everything. To be immortalized as damned was its own kind of vengeance. Even art became a weapon. As the medieval period drew toward its close, revenge began to take on a different tone, less tribal, more centralized, more tied to emerging nation-states. One of the final great revenge-driven conflicts of the medieval world was the War of the Roses in England. We have already seen Margaret of Anjou's fury, but the cycle did not end there. After years of bloodshed between Lancaster and York, a final figure emerged who would end the feud. His name was Henry VII of England. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, he defeated and killed Richard III of England. Richard's body was reportedly displayed publicly, a final humiliation. Henry married Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the warring houses. For the first time in generations, England stabilized. The age of feuding noble revenge gave way to stronger, centralized monarchy. The medieval era, soaked in vendetta and dynastic blood, was fading. Looking back across all these stories, one pattern remains clear. Revenge in medieval history was rarely about emotion alone. It was about legitimacy. It was about fear. It was about memory. Empires were erased because of insult. Queens burned cities for murdered husbands. Kings executed rebels to secure their crowns. Poets condemned enemies to eternal damnation. Crusader princes died for broken oaths. And entire wars ignited from assassinations disguised as justice. Revenge was not a side story in the Middle Ages. It was one of its driving forces. It shaped borders. It toppled dynasties. It ended empires. And in many ways it defined the era. By the late medieval world, revenge was no longer just about survival. It was about rewriting destiny. It was about erasing humiliation so completely that future generations would only remember victory. And sometimes, the most devastating revenge came not from rage, but from patience. Let's return briefly to France, where the 100 Years' War refused to end cleanly. After the execution of Joan of Arc, England believed it had broken the spiritual backbone of French resistance. They were wrong. The French king, Charles VII of France, had once been dismissed as weak and uncertain. But over time, he restructured France's military system. He created one of the first standing royal armies in Western Europe. This was not emotional revenge. It was strategic revenge. Instead of relying purely on feudal levies, Charles invested in artillery, professional soldiers, and centralized command. One by one, English strongholds fell. By 1453, the same year Constantinople fell. The English had lost nearly all their territories in France except Calais. The war that had humiliated France for decades ended not with a single dramatic massacre, but with systematic reclamation. France did not burn London. It did not execute an English king. Instead, it removed English power from French soil Sometimes revenge is quiet. Sometimes it is simply survival turned into resurgence. Now let's move north again, to Scandinavia, where dynastic revenge would drown a kingdom in blood. In 1520, Christian II of Denmark sought to consolidate his rule over Sweden, which had long resisted Danish dominance under the Kalmar Union. He promised reconciliation. He promised amnesty. Swedish nobles were invited to a coronation celebration in Stockholm. For 3 days, festivities unfolded. On the 4th day, accusations of heresy were announced. Dozens of Swedish nobles and clergy were arrested. They were executed in what became known as the Stockholm bloodbath. Bodies piled in the city square. It was meant to crush Swedish resistance permanently. It was meant to send a message: defy Denmark, and you die. But once again, medieval revenge miscalculated human memory. Among those affected was a young nobleman named Gustav Vasa. His father had been executed in the massacre. Gustav fled. He hid. He rallied support among peasants and miners. Within 3 years, Sweden rose in rebellion. Christian II was overthrown. Gustav Vasa became king. Sweden left the Kalmar Union permanently. One massacre meant to secure a crown ended up destroying it. Revenge creates resistance. Now we return to the Iberian Peninsula, where betrayal within families was almost expected. One of the most ruthless revenge stories centers on Pedro I of Portugal and the woman he loved. Pedro fell in love with Inez de Castro, a noblewoman. Their relationship became politically dangerous. His father, King Afonso IV, feared her family's influence. In 1355, while Pedro was away, Inez was executed. When Pedro became king, he did not forget. He hunted down her killers. They were captured. According to chroniclers, Pedro personally oversaw their execution. Some accounts claim their hearts were torn out. Whether embellished or not, the message was unmistakable. He declared that he and Inez had secretly married. He ordered her body exhumed. He had her dressed in royal garments and placed on a throne. Courtiers were forced to kiss the hand of the dead queen. It was macabre. It was theatrical. It was unforgettable. Pedro ensured that the woman executed as a political inconvenience would be remembered as queen. Revenge, in this case, was about rewriting reality itself. Revenge also shaped the eastern edges of Europe. The rise of the Ottoman Empire created cycles of retaliation between Christian and Muslim powers for centuries. One of the most dramatic figures in that struggle was Vlad III Dracula. Known to many as Vlad the Impaler, he ruled Wallachia under constant pressure from the Ottomans. As a child, he had been held as a hostage in the Ottoman court. Humiliation marked his early life. When he returned to power, his rule became synonymous with brutality. Impaling enemies became his signature method of punishment. When Ottoman forces invaded, he reportedly left fields of impaled soldiers as psychological warfare. This was revenge transformed into spectacle. He wanted fear to travel faster than armies. To some, he was a sadistic tyrant. To others, he was a defender of his homeland against overwhelming odds. Like many medieval avengers, his legacy depends on perspective. By the end of the medieval era, one pattern had repeated again and again. Revenge intended to eliminate opposition often created heroes. Executions created martyrs. Massacres sparked rebellions. Humiliation fueled resistance. And rulers who thought fear would secure obedience often planted the seeds of their own downfall. The Middle Ages were not uniquely violent, but they were uniquely personal. Power was tied to bloodlines. Honor was tied to reputation. An insult demanded response. from Genghis Khan annihilating an empire for killing his envoys, to Olga of Kiev burning a city for her husband, to queens toppling kings, to poets condemning enemies in eternal verse. Revenge shaped medieval history as much as faith, trade, or conquest. And in many cases, revenge did not simply settle scores. It built nations. It ended dynasties. It marked the transition from medieval fragmentation to early modern centralization. Because as the era closed, rulers slowly learned something dangerous. Revenge is powerful, but stability is stronger. As the medieval world edged toward its end, revenge stopped being only a response to insult or betrayal. It became a force of transition. The old rules, blood for blood, family for family, began colliding with new realities, mass movements, ideology, and collective punishment. Revenge no longer belonged only to kings and queens. Now, entire societies took part. And nowhere was this clearer than during the darkest catastrophe of the Middle Ages. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it killed indiscriminately. Kings died, peasants died, clergy died, whole villages vanished. Medieval people did not understand bacteria or transmission. They searched for meaning, and for someone to blame. That search turned deadly. Across Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with dark forces. These accusations were false, but fear does not require evidence. What followed were massacres, expulsions, and executions in cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz. This was revenge without a crime, violence born from panic. And it revealed something new. Revenge could be collective, ideological, and horrifyingly efficient. It was no longer personal honor driving the blade. It was fear weaponized against minorities. This marked a turning point. Medieval revenge was evolving, and not for the better. But not all late medieval revenge was blind. Some of it was aimed directly at power itself. In Bohemia, the execution of one man ignited a revolutionary war. His name was Jan Hus. Hus criticized corruption in the Catholic Church and preached reform. He was promised safe conduct to attend the Council of Constance in 1415. That promise was broken. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Bohemia exploded. The Hussite wars that followed were not just religious conflicts. They were revenge campaigns. Hus's followers defeated crusade after crusade sent against them. They developed innovative battlefield tactics and turned wagons into mobile fortresses. For decades, Bohemia resisted the combined military might of Europe. The Church had intended to silence a critic. Instead, it created an army, and that pattern should feel familiar by now. Further west, in the Alps, revenge reshaped an entirely new political model. The Swiss Confederation did not emerge from royal decree. It emerged from defiance. When the Habsburgs attempted to impose control over Alpine communities, local resistance turned violent. At the Battle of Morgarten, lightly armored Swiss fighters ambushed heavily armored knights in narrow terrain. It was a humiliation for one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, and it was remembered. Over the following centuries, Swiss independence hardened through repeated victories against external domination. This was revenge transformed into identity. A people refusing to be ruled again, not through terror, but through unity. By the 15th century, rulers had learned something crucial. Uncontrolled revenge destabilized kingdoms, so they began absorbing it. Centralized courts replaced private vendettas. Royal justice replaced blood feuds. The state claimed a monopoly on punishment. This shift did not end revenge. It formalized it. Executions became public theater. Trials became instruments of control. Punishment became spectacle. Not for the victim, but for the audience. The medieval age ended not because violence disappeared, but because violence was reorganized. Personal revenge gave way to political enforcement, and the world changed. When we look back across every story in this series, a single truth stands above all others. Revenge built the medieval world. It toppled empires and created them. It inspired queens, crusaders, peasants, poets, and conquerors. It burned cities, crowned kings, and erased families from history. But it also carried a lesson the Middle Ages learned the hard way. Revenge never ends a story. It only passes it forward. That is why medieval history feels so relentless. Why conflicts stretch across generations. Why every victory already contains the seed of the next war. Because, in the medieval mind, forgetting was weakness, and remembering meant action. Untold stories and shadowed vendettas. Even after 8 parts, the medieval world still hides countless revenge stories, many never fully recorded. Not every act of retaliation made it into chronicles. Some were whispered in court corridors. Others were carved into stone markers, lost to time. But they reveal the truth. In the Middle Ages, revenge was everywhere, and it often came from the least expected people. The poisoned feast of Ferrara in northern Italy, during the late 14th century, the Este family ruled Ferrara. Political marriages and alliances were fragile. One noblewoman, Alda d'Este, was humiliated when her dowry was withheld, and her family insulted by a rival branch. Rather than raising armies, Alda chose subtler, deadlier revenge. At a grand banquet celebrating her rival son's birthday, she secretly poisoned the wine. Several nobles died overnight. Others fell gravely ill. Her family regained influence, while the rival branch was permanently weakened. This is a perfect example of revenge being both personal and political, subtle yet catastrophic. In medieval Italy, cunning often mattered more than brute force. The feud of the Montagues and Capulets. Though immortalized in literature, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet reflects real patterns of medieval vengeance. In Italy, many noble families engaged in multi-generational feuds over power, honor, or insults. These feuds often began with a single insult or attack and escalated over decades. One of the most brutal patterns was in Verona, where families assassinated members of rival clans, destroyed property, and staged public humiliations. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the law often failed to contain them, and revenge became almost hereditary. A family tradition of violence and honor enforcement. The lesson? Medieval vengeance was rarely one-off. It perpetuated itself, creating cycles that could last centuries. Revenge in the courts of France. We've seen kings execute rebels, and poets condemn rivals in verse. But sometimes revenge was judicial and calculated over decades. One such case involves Charles VI of France's court and the notorious nobleman Jean de Chatillon. After Chatillon was accused of betraying the crown, he fled and plotted quietly for years. Using alliances, marriage, and bribery, he eventually orchestrated the arrest of several of his original accusers. By the time he returned to court, those who had condemned him were ruined or executed. Medieval revenge could wait a generation and strike precisely, often disguised as justice. Patience was as deadly as a sword. The silent revenge of widows. Not all revenge in medieval history came from kings, princes, or warriors. Widows and noblewomen also wielded power in subtle but devastating ways. One famous case is that of Marguerite of Burgundy, whose husband was killed in a political assassination. Instead of rallying armies immediately, Marguerite maneuvered politically, cultivating alliances with neighboring lords. Over the next decade, she systematically destroyed the careers, influence, and lives of those responsible for her husband's death. Her revenge was almost invisible, woven into marriages, inheritances, and fealty oaths. Yet when it unfolded, the impact was total. Families fell, lands changed hands, and her enemies were eliminated without a single battlefield confrontation. Lessons from medieval revenge. By this stage of the Middle Ages, revenge had evolved into a cultural code. Patience is power. Immediate retaliation was not always effective. Long-term planning could destroy enemies permanently. Symbolism mattered. Humiliation, public execution, and ceremonial punishment reinforced fear and authority. Revenge is contagious. One act of vengeance often triggered decades of feuds and wars. Even the weak could strike. Women, poets, merchants, and minor nobles could orchestrate deadly revenge through cunning and strategy. The medieval world was a theater of memory and reprisal. Every insult, betrayal, or humiliation could spark cycles of violence that shaped kingdoms and empires. The medieval era eventually gave way to centralized monarchies and early modern states, where revenge became less personal and more institutional. But the echoes of these stories survived in legends, literature, and the very structure of European politics. Legacy of medieval vengeance. The medieval era left behind more than castles, cathedrals, and chronicles. It left behind a legacy of revenge, woven into families, kingdoms, and cultures, that would echo long after the last knight laid down his sword. By the late 15th century, Europe was transitioning. Centralized monarchies, standing armies, and formal courts began replacing private vendettas. But the stories of revenge never disappeared. They were remembered, retold, and often reshaped the world that came after. Revenge that shaped borders. Take the Italian city-states. Decades of feuds, assassinations, and betrayals between families like the Medici, Pazzi, and Visconti did not just settle personal scores. They determined who controlled trade routes, who levied taxes, and who influenced the papacy. The Pazzi conspiracy, 1478, didn't just fail to kill Lorenzo de' Medici. It reshaped Florence. Lorenzo's revenge consolidated power, strengthened banking influence, and ensured his family dominated the city for generations. Revenge had redrawn political lines without a single foreign invasion. Revenge that fueled wars. In England, the Wars of the Roses were more than dynastic conflict. They were centuries of revenge codified into battle strategy. Every massacre, beheading, and exile carried the memory of previous insults. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field, 1485, symbolically ended the centuries-long feud between Lancaster and York, but the need for revenge shaped his reign. He married Elizabeth of York not only for alliance, but to unite the warring factions, turning cycles of revenge into political stability. Even then, rebellions and plots lingered. The memory of blood could not be erased easily. Medieval vengeance became a tool to maintain power as much as it was a personal moral code, cultural and literary legacy. Medieval revenge also shaped literature and art. From Dante condemning his enemies in the Divine Comedy to the stories of Vlad the Impaler inspiring legends of Dracula, revenge became immortalized in culture. Even tales that seem romantic or fictional, like Romeo and Juliet, reflect the very real patterns of vendetta and intergenerational conflict. Medieval revenge became a moral and psychological lesson. Insult carries consequences. Betrayal leaves scars. Vengeance can redefine entire societies. Lessons from the medieval age of revenge. Across all 10 parts, one theme stands out. Revenge is powerful, but it is rarely final. Revenge shapes history. From empires to families, Retaliation directs the rise and fall of rulers. Revenge is personal and political. Kings, queens, nobles, and commoners all wielded it differently, but each act influenced broader society. Cycles of vengeance endure. A single act often triggered decades of feuds, wars, or political instability. Memory is a weapon. Public humiliation, executions, and literary condemnation ensured that revenge echoed through generations. Revenge evolves. From personal vendettas to judicial and state-sanctioned punishment, medieval revenge laid the foundation for modern concepts of justice and deterrence. Forgotten and shadowed vendettas. Even after 10 parts of epic revenge stories, the medieval world still has countless acts of vengeance that history almost forgot. These are the shadowed tales, the quiet, calculated, or mysterious retributions that never made chronicles, or were whispered in fear rather than celebrated. While kings, queens, and armies dominate history books, sometimes the most cunning revenge came from the margins. Minor nobles, merchants, widows, and exiled figures who shaped events from the shadows. The silent revenge of exiled princes. Exile did not mean surrender. In many cases, it was the perfect setup for revenge. One forgotten story comes from a minor Italian prince, Galazzo I Visconti, exiled from Milan after a political coup. Instead of rallying armies immediately, he built alliances over a decade. Using bribery, marriages, and strategic marriages, he returned not as a minor player, but as the kingmaker of Lombardy. Those who had ousted him found themselves politically ruined, their land seized, and their families forced into obedience. This shows that medieval revenge was not always violent. It could be invisible, patient, and unstoppable. The merchant's revenge. Merchants, often overlooked in historical revenge narratives, could wield enormous influence. In 14th century Venice, a wealthy merchant named Marco Zorzi was cheated by a trading rival who had falsified contracts and ruined his business. Instead of dueling or resorting to assassination, Marco used the Venetian courts and alliances with other merchant families. Within years, his rival's ships were seized, trade privileges revoked, and his reputation destroyed. In a world where commerce was life, revenge could strike as effectively through law and economy as through sword or fire. Revenge through marriage. Marriage was another instrument of vengeance. One obscure but chilling example involves Isabella of Bavaria, whose family had been insulted by another noble house. Instead of open conflict, Isabella arranged her daughter's marriage to the heir of her rival, consolidating property, titles, and influence. Over decades, her family regained control over lands and political sway, and the rival house slowly faded from prominence. Medieval revenge was strategic. It could span generations and reshape entire regions without a single battle. Assassination in the shadows. Not all revenge was public. Some of the most effective vendettas were entirely secret. In 13th century Sicily, a nobleman betrayed his ally during a war over land disputes. Historians record that the betrayed party, a minor prince, returned years later under the guise of a diplomat. One night, the prince personally oversaw the execution of the conspirator within his palace. No armies, no public spectacle, just a calculated strike that ended the threat permanently. In these cases, revenge was personal, precise, and invisible, yet just as final as any battlefield massacre. Lessons from forgotten vengeance. Patience was as deadly as rage. Revenge could be delayed for decades until the perfect moment. Strategy outweighed emotion. Many acts of revenge were calculated to maximize social, political, or economic impact. Influence could replace force. Lawsuits, marriages, alliances, and commerce were all weapons. Memory ensured continuity. Even when deeds were secret, their consequences reshaped family legacies and regional politics. Why these stories matter. The forgotten acts of revenge remind us that medieval society was not just about kings and battles. It was about human ambition, honor, and the desire to correct wrongs, even quietly. These shadowed vendettas reveal that revenge could take many forms. Brutal and public like Genghis Khan's campaigns. Calculated and personal like Olga of Kiev's vengeance. Invisible and patient like exiled princes or merchant families reclaiming power. In every case, the medieval world showed that vengeance was more than emotion. It was a tool, a strategy, and a legacy. Legendary and mythical acts of revenge. The medieval world thrives on legend as much as fact. Many revenge stories blur the line between history and myth, but their impact is undeniable. These tales passed through chronicles, ballads, and oral tradition, shaped medieval culture, influenced politics, and inspired fear, even when the exact details may never be fully verified. The Revenge of William Tell. In the late medieval period, the legend of William Tell captured the imagination of generations. Though historians debate its accuracy, the story embodies the power of personal vengeance. Tell, a skilled marksman, was forced by a tyrannical bailiff to shoot an apple off his son's head. Refusing to bend to oppression, he succeeded, then later killed the bailiff. This act sparked a rebellion that eventually led to the formation of the Swiss Confederation. Even if partially mythical, the tale reflects a recurring medieval theme. Revenge can ignite liberation movements, and a single courageous act can resonate for centuries. The ghostly revenge of the Tower of London. Legends of the Tower of London include stories of spectral vengeance. Nobles imprisoned and executed often returned in folklore to haunt their killers or oppressors. One famous story involves the princes in the Tower, Edward V of England, and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury. Their disappearance, likely orchestrated by Richard III of England, became legendary. Ghostly legends of their revenge haunted the Tower, feeding political narratives, influencing public perception, and giving moral weight to subsequent regime changes. Even myths could enforce the medieval idea: betrayal is never forgotten, and vengeance can echo beyond death. The revenge of the cursed knight. Medieval ballads often tell stories of knights wronged by treachery, returning from exile or death to punish their enemies. One such tale recounts a knight betrayed by his liege lord, left for dead after a battle. Surviving in secret, he trained, gained allies, and returned decades later to reclaim his lands and punish his former lord. These narratives were exaggerated, but they carried social truths. Medieval revenge was expected, feared, and sometimes glorified, even in legend. The line between heroic justice and brutal vendetta was often deliberately blurred, emphasizing the cultural importance of retaliation. Revenge as moral and didactic tool. Many of these legendary stories were not just entertainment. They taught lessons. Honor must be defended, even at personal risk. Betrayal will eventually be punished. Courage and cunning are essential tools for survival. Revenge can elevate ordinary individuals into lasting heroes. From William Tell to the spectral tales of the Tower, revenge became a moral compass in folklore, reinforcing societal norms while inspiring fear and respect. The enduring legacy of medieval revenge. By the conclusion of this final part, a clear picture emerges. Revenge in the medieval world was multifaceted. It could be brutal and public, like Genghis Khan's campaigns. Personal and calculated, like Olga of Kiev or Pedro I of Portugal. Strategic and patient, like exiled princes or merchant families. legendary or mythical, like William Tell, ghosts, or cursed knights. These stories shaped Europe's political landscape, inspired literature and art, and influenced the psychology of power for centuries. Medieval revenge was not simply retaliation. It was a language of justice, fear, and reputation that defined the era. Revenge in the Middle Ages was never a simple act. It was an instrument of power, a reflection of culture, and a warning to friend and foe alike. From the battlefields of the Mongol Empire to the cobbled streets of Florence, from royal courts to folklore, revenge drove history forward, shaped identities, and left a legacy that still fascinates us today. The medieval world, steeped in honor, betrayal, and vengeance, reminds us that human nature, ambition, pride, and the desire for justice, transcends time. And while swords have been sheathed and empires have fallen, the stories of revenge continue to captivate, instruct, and warn us. Never underestimate the force of a wronged heart. By the 16th century, the age of chivalric revenge was giving way to state power, diplomacy, and law. But the stories remain. Reminders that in a world without centralized authority, human emotions could shape the fate of nations. From Genghis Khan annihilating an empire for insult, to Olga of Kiev burning an entire city for her husband, to Joan of Arc rewriting the destiny of France, medieval revenge defined the era. It was brutal, it was calculated, it was transformative. And it teaches us one enduring truth. Power, honor, and human pride can ignite actions that echo across centuries. Medieval revenge may have ended as a public, personal spectacle, but its lessons of caution, of strategy, and of the consequences of betrayal remain timeless.